Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast is your one-stop shop for fantasy football news and advice. Can't decide on who to draft on the first round? Going gaga on how to line up your team. Got you covered. Traditional leagues, dynasty league, PPR league, IDP league, even daily fantasy football league. Join us as we break down all the questions of fantasy football. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
And welcome in to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, BSP, Brandon Soder-Penner. Happy Rankings Day, guys. Yes, we have made it all the way back, finished the wide receiver preview series, and today going to list off my top 30 NFL fantasy wide receivers for this 2020 season. Other than that, though, still got plenty to get to. I'm going to answer your 5 burning questions here in the first segment. And then we're going to do the formatting a little bit different. I'm going to end the show with the last 2 segments going to be going through those top 30 wide receivers as I promised. So that means in the second segment, still going to give you a top 10 as well. I'm going to go through the top 10 individual defensive players for fantasy. It's a little bit of an oddball mode, but if you happen to be a fantasy owner looking at defensive players this year, I'm going to break some of that down for you. It was a really nice exercise for me as well. It's not something that I was super familiar with. And I'm sure I'm not alone in that fantasy realm. So I'm going to have some fun going through that with you. And then, like I said, top 30 fantasy wide receivers to round out the show today. Before we really start diving in, a couple little bits of news for you guys. First off, Antonio Brown was officially handed down an 8-game suspension. That means if a team does decide to sign him before the season starts, it's at least going to be 8 games before we see him on the field. Now, given this news, and I guess I should have seen it coming, but I'm kind of flipping my stance here on Antonio Brown. I did say he is someone that might be worth targeting at the very end of your draft as a lottery ticket because this guy's a potential wide receiver 1 if he's on the field. However, now, we still don't know if he's going to get signed by a team. And if he is, he's going to just be rotting at the end of your bench for more than half of your fantasy season. And that's a spot that you can use for one of these crucial waiver wire pickups early, or to grab a late breakout player, or just to be able to fly guys and pick up some good matchups as the year goes on. So at this point, the value that Antonio Brown is going to provide is just not worth it anymore. I've made this mistake with A.J. Green last year. Obviously, it wasn't the same deal. It wasn't that he was facing a suspension, but I drafted A.J. Green with my last pick, even though he was injured, thinking, all right, he's going to miss a few weeks, he's going to come back, and he's got the potential to be a wide receiver 1. And every week there was something else going on, and he never saw the field. And he ended up being on my bench until about week 8 or 9, because you don't want to cut bait with someone like that, because the whole reason you drafted him was to stash him for later. So long story short, guys, Antonio Brown no longer worth the flyer pick. It'll be interesting to see if he does land somewhere. There hasn't really been a lot of rumors since the Seattle rumblings about a month ago, so it's not worth it for you. And then, guys, as promised, at the beginning of each episode now, I am going to go through the COVID opt-out list just to let you know if there's anything from a fantasy perspective that you need to be worried about, at least for the time being. So Damian Williams was the big name last week that decided to opt out. There's really nobody since then. It's only been a couple of days, but nobody since then that's really going to affect your fantasy team. But there are a couple of note. First off, the Patriots. I don't know what is going on in New England right now, but 8 Patriot players have already opted out for the 2020 season, most notably Patrick Chung, Donta Hightower, and then Marquise Lee, all now opting out. So nobody that's going to really affect you from a fantasy perspective. There's a backup running back, a backup tight end, a couple of defensive players. Nobody that you should really be super worried about quite yet. Bills have a couple of key defensive players that have decided to opt out. Defensive tackle Star Lotulelei and then cornerback E.J. Gaines now both opting out for the 2020 season. Might have a slight fantasy impact. I mentioned to you guys that the Bills were my number one fantasy defense going into 2020. They haven't lost a superstar yet, but again, two big defensive pieces are now gone for the Bills. And then the Jets, perhaps the biggest name on this list since the last episode, linebacker C.J. Mosley, who they gave a nice contract to, I believe it was last season to bring him in, has now opted out. And the situation for the Jets just continues to deteriorate. Didn't think they were going to be a good team as it is, but C.J. Mosley really is the quarterback of that defense. Jamal Adams is now gone as well. It is going to be a long year in New York. All right, so that is your NFL news update. Let's go ahead and start diving into the 5 burning fantasy questions for today's episode. Make sure, guys, that you get your questions submitted. You can find us on Twitter. It's the easiest way to get involved with the show. You can tweet us at GSMC_F football. And then you could also get me at my personal Twitter. That's at LAMachine17, LaMachine17. Just go ahead and tweet directly at us. We'll make sure to get any of your fantasy questions answered in the upcoming episode. I'll make sure to mention you on air as well. And as always, does not even have to be a fantasy question. The last one, the 5th question is always a little bit of an oddball. So if you've got something on your mind that is just eating at you, even if it's not fantasy related, go ahead and send that over and we will analyze it thoroughly. All right, guys, so 5 burning fantasy questions. Number 1, how should you utilize ADP in your draft? Now, at this point, if you don't know, ADP stands for average draft position. It is a culmination of online and offline drafts from multiple platforms all brought together, and what the information shows is the average position where a player is drafted with a number. So, for example, guys, Christian McCaffrey is going number 1 in almost every league. His ADP is going to be 1. Then you have somebody like Michael Thomas, while he is the wide receiver 1, his average draft position is 4, right? He's taken after a few of the top-tier running backs. So that number just shows you where exactly a player is going in a draft on average. Now, how you can use that to your advantage is you can figure out when or if you have to reach for players that you really like. So, for example, I'm higher on the Broncos' Phillip Lindsay more than the average fantasy drafter. He's my running back 30. So I have more of a 5th, 6th round grade on him. And right now his ADP is sitting at 93, which means that on average he's going somewhere between the 7th and 8th rounds. Using that ADP, I know that even though I have a 6th round grade on Lindsay, I can still wait a round or two, and I'm still able to grab him, even if he is my top-rated running back on the board at that point. So it just allows you to understand when you're reaching and when you just don't have to, when you can sit back on guys despite your own personal ranking. So it's nice to really have both of those. I highly suggest having some sort of ADP tool up while you're doing your drafts. That way, you're not grabbing someone you like way earlier when you could have spent less draft capital on them later. So ADP is very important when it comes to starting off your draft. So number 2, sticking with the draft formatting, as a league commissioner, is there anything you can do to account for COVID-related scratches or the COVID's impact on the league as a whole? What are some things that you can do to help kind of counterbalance that? And for starters, I've heard this bounced around quite a bit, is to have additional injured reserve spots on your fantasy roster, slots where you can keep players that are not active and not just cut bait with them when you have to bring in their replacement, which can cause a lot of chaos if, one of your better guys gets COVID and has to sit out for a couple of weeks. So that's one way to do it. It just allows for more backups to be brought in, and it should limit the amount of craziness that's going to happen if something were to get serious, if this outbreak were to get crazy in the NFL circles. And then another thing, guys, with all the opt-outs happening right now, it is a very good idea to just push your drafts back as far as you can. It's going to allow you to see what players have already contracted COVID and shouldn't have to worry about that throughout the season. It's going to allow you to see who all has opted out by the time the NFL season starts to roll around, and it's going to allow you to see what the league is going to look like, guys. For example, if the league implements its plan to delay itself 4 weeks, they've got a contingency plan in place where they can take the first 4 weeks on the schedule and then just move it and attach it to the end of the schedule instead. If that were to happen, that changes some matchups. That changes your potential playoff matchups with players, and that's something you're going to want to know going into your draft. So to protect yourself from all of this, I know it's frustrating because we all want to get our fantasy teams going. We need that distraction right now. If you can push back your fantasy drafts to as close as the start of the season as possible, it's really going to help you out, and it's going to help your league be as smooth as possible. Like guys that have already drafted, we're seeing issues of, well, okay, how do I go about getting rid of the player that I drafted? When does free agency open up? Again, like Damian Williams owners, there are plenty of people that think that Damian Williams still had value. I was not one of them, but he was drafted by quite a few teams, and now those owners are kind of scrambling, trying to figure out what they're going to do to replace his value, and commissioners are trying to figure out how to go about that. So, again, the longer you can push the start of your league, the better, guys, because this is far from over. We're going to see a lot more names pop up on this COVID opt-out list, and you just want to be as informed as possible going into your draft, and this is the best possible way to do that. All right, so number 3, who have been some of the biggest risers since the original running back rankings that you put out? So my running back rankings were a little over a couple weeks ago, my top 30. There has been some movement based on news that we've gotten throughout the season. So the biggest riser by far was Raheem Mostert. I was very worried about Mostert because he was demanding a trade. He wasn't happy with his contract. It looked like it could be a potentially messy situation in San Francisco, and I really questioned Mostert's value on any other team because he really hasn't been able to produce anywhere aside from San Francisco. Good news, though, they resolved the contract issues. He's there to stay in San Francisco, and he is the clear number one back. They love to do running back by committee, but Raheem Mostert compared to Tevin Coleman and Jerick McKinnon, I really don't think there's much of a comparison there. There's a large gap. Mostert is the most talented out of those guys, so he moved from being outside of my top 30 running backs. I now have him all the way up to 21. He's one step above David Johnson, one behind Le'Veon Bell right now. You do have risk there with the running back by committee approach, but even if that's something that Shanahan implements all season, Mostert is still going to have some good value for you week in and week out. Always going to be a touchdown threat, and he's going to get more of a workhorse load than he did last year with Matt Breida now gone. So even if it's running back by committee all year, there is less competition and more touches to go around. So Raheem Mostert now up to my number 21 running back for the 2020 season. Clyde Edwards-Helaire, he didn't make a huge jump on my board because I already had him higher than most, but pretty significant still for where he was at. He was my running back 7. I bumped him up one spot now to 6. I've got him just behind Joe Mixon and one spot above Derrick Henry. And, of course, this is because Damian Williams, the supposed backup running back for Kansas City, who was their starter last year in their Super Bowl season, has opted out of the 2020 season. I did not see Damian Williams as much of a threat, but he was still there, so I had to hold back on Edwards-Helaire just a little bit. But now that he's gone, and this is clearly Clyde's job, he is a solid top 6 running back for me. The only reason he's not higher is because he's obviously not proven yet, so I would rather take a guy like Joe Mixon, who's had some time to get acclimated to the league. But then I am willing to take him above Derrick Henry just because Henry's going to be very touchdown dependent, guys. He's not utilized in the passing game at all, and that's okay. He's a workhorse back. He's going to run the ball a ton, but the touchdown potential is a little bit limited with him because he's only used in one aspect of the offense, whereas a guy like Clyde Edwards-Helaire, I think, is going to be utilized all over the field, both as a running back and as a short route wide receiver. So Edwards-Helaire just has a little more potential to blow up, and with Damian Williams gone, his floor has just gotten that much higher. So Clyde Edwards-Helaire, now my number 6 running back going into the 2020 fantasy season. And then the last one of note, guys, is Dalvin Cook. Of course, the news with Cook, it's still not completely official, but it looks like he's going to be starting to show up to training camp and participate in the off-season programs. This is obviously significant because there were reports all throughout the offseason that Dalvin Cook was going to hold out for a better contract, as he is still on the last year of his rookie deal. So now that that's cleared up and it looks like Cook is going to be back, I have bumped him from 10 up to 8 in my rankings. I've got him just behind Derrick Henry, who is going to get, I think, more volume than Dalvin Cook throughout the year, and then one above Josh Jacobs. And Jacobs, similar to Henry, has some of the same limitations. He's not going to be used in the passing game as well, but Henry's a little more established as Jacobs, and then Dalvin Cook is another player like Hilaire who's going to be utilized in multiple points of the offense. So I've got him smack dab in the middle of those two. He is now my number 8 running back for the 2020 fantasy football season. So those have been the big movers since the last rankings episode. Now, number 4, going to get into defense a little more here. As I mentioned, next segment, I'm going to go through the top 10 individual defensive players for 2020. But on the same vein, which defensive special teams combinations have the biggest bust risk at their current ADP? So the defenses that you're traditionally drafting for your fantasy football team, where you're choosing the team instead of the individual defensive players, as I mentioned. So there's 2 that really stick out to me. Chicago, for some unknown reason, is up at number 6. I'm already not super impressed with their defense. They've got Khalil Mack, which is going to provide you some value. But outside of that, guys, the defense is mediocre, and that they're tied to a horrible offense. That offense is going to crash and burn this season. I am not sold on either of the quarterbacks that they have right now in Trubisky or Nick Foles. I see a lot of turnovers for the Chicago Bears this year on the offensive side of the ball, and that just means the defense is going to be out there a ton. And that is not necessarily good for fantasy value. If you're not a top-tier defense like Seattle was a few years ago, even Chicago more recently, those guys, if they're on the field more, they have the opportunity to force turnovers, fumbles, things like that, and can rack up points for you. But in this instance, they're going to be out on the field more, and I think more points are going to end up getting put on them, and you've got the potential to finish with a negative defense multiple weeks this year. It's not an easy schedule for them at all, and they can really hurt your fantasy value and just drag your fantasy point total down, and that's just not worth it for me for a number 6 ADP defense. And then the other one that sticks out, guys, is Pittsburgh, and this has less to do with their actual defense because they've got a lot of great pieces. Minka Fitzpatrick, TJ Watt. It's a great young defensive front, but this is another defense that has the potential to be tied to a very bad offense. I know some people are high on Pittsburgh with Ben Roethlisberger coming back, but I'll keep hammering the point home. There's a lot of things that have to go right for the offense to click like it was before Big Ben's injury, and I just don't see everything falling into place for them like that. Ben's got to be healthy. He's got to be at the same point that he was before he was injured, and he has to start the season quicker than he has in the last couple of healthy seasons that he's played. He has gotten off to slow starts year after year, and they seem to go a game longer each time. So there's a ton of question marks around this. So again, Pittsburgh has the potential to be the defense has the potential to be out there on the field a ton, and while it's a solid defense, again, not the easiest schedule in the world, they can realistically drop 5 or 6 defensive spots throughout the year just because they're not going to be getting any real offensive support, or at least the potential exists, and it exists enough for me to not be taking them as the number 2 defense this year. That's just a lot of draft capital for a risky proposition. So number 5 now, guys. Enough with the fantasy questions. Going to go a little more off the wall for you. I know you guys like rankings. We're doing a lot of rankings this episode. Ranking IDP players. We're ranking the top 30 wide receivers. And now we're going to rank fast food French fries. So I did the top 5 best and the bottom 5 worst fast food fries. Now, before I get into this, it should be noted, these are just the fries on their own. There's no sauce here. There's no specialty to them. Just the fries straight up, because I realize that when you start talking about like cheese fries and these different creative ways that fast food places like to put them together, you're talking about a completely different category. But just the base fry is the criteria here. So I'll go through the worst. Number 5 is Burger King. They're not bad by any means, but they're just nothing special, right? I mean, if you get them hot, they're decent. They get the job done. I can live with them. Number 4 is Raising Cane's. I know Cane's is a little more localized. They've got a couple out on the West Coast. They're starting to pop up here in the Midwest a lot more. And they're not seasoned, guys. If you get them fresh, they're still hot. They're still crispy and everything. They're like those crinkle cut fries, but they don't season them at all. And I always have to add my own seasoning when I get home. And it's not ideal because if I'm eating them out on the road, they're just blah. You need sauces and things to make them worth it. Number 3 is Chick-fil-A. I'm sorry, guys. The waffle fry is just kind of overplayed here. Again, not a ton of seasoning on it. It's just nothing special. I've had significantly better waffle fries other places. Specifically, again, talking about Midwest-oriented, Mr. Hero is another local sandwich shop that just does it so much better than Chick-fil-A does. So, again, I'm usually avoiding the fries when I go to Chick-fil-A because they're nothing special. Number 2, Wendy's. Guys, they switched over to these like natural cut fries a few years ago, and they're blah. That's the best word I can give you for it. They never really come out super fresh. They have no flavor to them. They're just blah. I have no other way to describe it. Not a big fan whatsoever. And then number 1, guys, I am so sorry if you're on the West Coast listening to this. In-N-Out's fries, when you don't get them animal style, are absolutely disgusting. They come out soggy and wet and flavorless and seasonless and God. I accidentally got them plain once and it was the worst mistake of my life. Animal style, completely different story. They're amazing when you start adding like the specialty sauce and the grilled onions and all that other good crap. But on their own, guys, do not suggest 0 out of 10. Just avoid them like the plague. Or like Corona, a little more topical. All right, guys, so the top 5 fast food fries. We're getting to ones that are a little more exciting. Honorable mention here, KFC. They had potato wedges before. They've taken them away and just switched them with a generic fry. Potato wedges were kind of in a category on their own. Really liked them. They were really thick, fluffy, still had like a crispy outside. So because they don't exist anymore, they didn't make my top 5, but they were definitely worth mentioning. Number 5 is an item that pops in and out. It's a seasonal thing with Taco Bell, but their nacho fries, even without the cheese sauce, which is part of the criteria, are still amazing. They do like a taco seasoning on the outside of them. They always come out really well. Just love them. Definitely deserve a spot on this list. The only reason they're not higher is because they are seasonal. Number 4 is Arby's. Traditional curly fry, you can't really beat it, and I've yet to have a curly fry that I don't like. I don't know if they're just always consistent or what it is, but I've never had a bad order of curly fries come out from Arby's. Number 3, Five Guys. Now, part of the criteria here with Five Guys is not only the fry itself, which is already delicious. They season it really well. It's a fresh cut fry, but you get a ton of them. You get a truckload of fries no matter what size you order. It's actually hilarious because they will give you the cup of fries and then they will just take another massive handful and just throw them in the bag for you. So it's quality and quantity here. So Five Guys lands at number 3 for me. Number 2 is McDonald's. Guys, oh my God. There's nothing better than a fresh, hot McDonald's fry. It's thin, it's crispy, it's salted perfectly. It's everything you want. The only reason it's not number 1, guys, is because I cannot even count the number of times I've gotten them soggy like they've been sitting out for a long time. As recently as last night, I tried to get some on our way home from a party, and they tasted like they had been sitting in a warmer for hours. But when they are fresh, it's really hard to beat. But then number 1, and if I'm correct, they should have these all over the country. It's Rallies or Checkers, depending on where you are listening. The fries have a crazy amount of seasoning on the outside of them that makes them really crunchy, super flavorful. I never need any kind of ketchup or sauce or anything for them. And this is another one. I've never gotten a bad order of Rallies fries. If you have not gotten to try them, you absolutely need to. You can see the seasoning coated completely on the outside of the fry. So get up there right now and try it. If you have not, I promise you it is absolutely life-changing. So there you have it, guys. Rallies, the best fast food fry. Rallies or Checkers, if you are in the South. The best fast food French fry. When we come back, going to list off the top 10 individual defensive players for 2020. And then, of course, for the second half of the show, going to give you the top 30 fantasy wide receivers for the 2020 season. You're listening to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. We'll be right back.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines, they got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
And welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. I am your host, BSP Brandon Soderpenner. Last segment went over the updated COVID opt-out list, had some new news for you on Antonio Brown, and then answered your 5 burning fantasy questions for today's episode. So moving on, guys, you're going to notice the formatting's a little different today. That's because the last 2 segments of the show, as I mentioned, are going to be the top 30 fantasy wide receivers for 2020. Next segment going to give you numbers 30 to 16, and then the final segment of the show will get you the top 15 wide receivers going into next season. So we're going to give you the top 10 ranking for today's episode right now, and for today we're going to go over the top 10 individual defensive players for the 2020 season. So this is a little bit more of a, I don't want to say a taboo format, but it's definitely one of the least common formats that you'll see, where instead of drafting a collective defense special teams unit, you'll actually draft individual defensive players to round out your lineup. With the argument being, like, imagine if it was flipped, you wouldn't draft one team's offense to handle all of your fantasy workload. So it's an interesting format. It involves a lot more strategy, and it's not necessarily focused on the positions that you would think. So what I noticed is that linebackers are by far the most popular, at least at the top of the draft, and then edge rushers are in there as well, because you're basically looking for big stat guys, right? You get point totals for pretty much anything that you can do on the defensive front, and if you've got someone like a Bobby Wagner, for example, who can do a little bit of everything on the field, can get involved with tackles, with sacks, with interceptions, pass deflections, all that kind of stuff, you can rack up points very quickly. So just to go through the scoring formats, on average, these are the point totals that you're usually looking at for different defensive achievements. So tackles and assisted tackles, depending on the position, somewhere between 1 and 1.5 points. Tackles for loss, 2.5 to 3.5. Sacks, 4 to 4.5. Quarterback hits generally are half a point. Deflected passes, you get 3 points. Forced fumbles, 3 points. 5 points each for fumble recoveries, interceptions, blocked field goals, and blocked punts. If your player is able to record a safety, that is 10 points for you. Defensive conversion returns, 2 points. You don't really see that all that often. Defensive touchdowns, you get 6 points. And then if you're drafting special teams, you get 1 point for every 25 return yards. So as you've noticed, some of the points can vary a little bit, and that's because different defensive plays are going to be worth more depending on the position. Like a tackle for a cornerback is going to be worth more for you than a tackle from a defensive lineman. But for the most part, those totals are pretty close together. So let's go ahead and get into the top 10 individual defensive players for this season. Number 5 is Corey Littleton, the linebacker for the now Las Vegas Raiders. And the reason he's on here, he had a great season last year, was able to rack up a ton of tackles, and this year I don't see it being any different. He has no real competition behind him. He's a great run-stopping linebacker, and that's going to allow him to have a pretty high floor without having a crazy ceiling. He's going to be playing out of that weak side linebacker spot, which is going to allow him, again, to just focus on run-stopping, and he will be a tackle machine for you this year. And then speaking of tackle machines, number 9 is Joe Schobert, the linebacker for now Jacksonville. He was Cleveland's linebacker for multiple years, led the league in tackles, or was at least close to the top of that statistic year in and year out. He's a tackle magnet, guys, playing that middle linebacker role. He's very smart as well. He plays a little bit of that, the quarterback of the defense type of a role. He's very good at identifying the weak spots in blocking schemes, and again, is just going to be able to rack up tackles and tackles for loss for you. He's good for a couple interceptions as well. He's pretty decent at tracking the ball, but again, just from a tackle standpoint, going to be able to rack up points for you very quickly. Number 8, first really big name on this list is Aaron Donald. He's also the only defensive tackle that cracked the top 10. These are not generally guys that you're going to want to draft super high because, again, you're just looking for pure statistics. And if a defensive tackle is doing his job, that generally means he's just gobbling up enough blockers for the edge rushers or the rushing linebacker to get through to the quarterback. Aaron Donald, though, is a different specimen. He's a Defensive Player of the Year candidate year in and year out because he goes above and beyond his duty and gets to the quarterback very often. So Donald, especially out of that defensive line spot, is very valuable in that you're not going to find anyone else at that tackle spot that's going to be able to rack up sacks and quarterback hits for you like Donald. And on top of that, he's a factor in the rushing game as well. He's going to be able to get a decent amount of tackles from that spot and will easily be able to lead at least the others at his same position group. So Aaron Donald there at number 8. Number 7, Myles Garrett, the defensive end for Cleveland. He is a sack monster. Before he was taken out prematurely last season with the suspension after the whole Mason Rudolph incident, he was on track to lead the NFL in sacks. He has a chance to do that again this year, though he does have some stiff competition in front of him. So if you're looking for someone that is just purely going to get you points off of those sack totals, Myles Garrett is definitely someone you want to be looking at. Number 6 is Blake Martinez, linebacker for the New York Giants. Guy's 144-plus tackles 3 years in a row in Green Bay. And now that he's in New York, I don't see that changing at all. That defense is not good. He has very limited competition and is going to just be plugged in and play that same exact kind of role. And on top of that, they're going to be on the field quite often. I mentioned that it could hurt a full defensive special teams unit if you're doing a more traditional league, if they're on the field more. However, it's kind of the opposite for the individual defensive players. There's less opportunity to lose points, if any at all, depending on your scoring formats. So Blake Martinez is going to be out on the field a lot, and that's going to lead to him putting up, again, some crazy tackle numbers, and we've seen him do this consistently now. Very safe pick at the number 6 spot. Number 5, Joey Bosa, man who just got paid out of Los Angeles. Again, a sack specialist. He's still very young. You don't have to worry about a holdout at this point. You know he's going to be on the field. Had some health issues early in his career, but has generally been healthy since then. So Joey Bosa, a very safe pick for you at edge rush. Number 4, Jalen Smith, the linebacker for Dallas. I did raise him a little bit here just because he's got less competition than I think people realize. Leighton Vander Esch, who had a great rookie season, playing on the other side of him, but since that rookie year, he's been pretty inconsistent, and on top of that, he's battling injury. So that leaves Jalen Smith open to really rack up a lot of these individual defensive stats, again, specifically with tackles, which is the big thing that you were looking for at a lot of these players. The cornerbacks are also kind of weak, so I wouldn't be surprised if you see Jalen Smith drop back into coverage specifically on slot corners every once in a while, and that's going to give him some opportunity to get interceptions in there as well. Number 3, guys, is Danielle Hunter, the defensive end for Minnesota. No, he's not the best edge rusher on this list. I don't think anyone can argue that, but again, we're talking about consistency. Year in and year out, he's good for 100-plus tackles. He's good for 10 sacks. It's a safe pick, and you're getting extra value out of him because a lot of edge rushers are great at getting the sack, but are not necessarily consistent tackle getters and tackle for loss guys. But Danielle Hunter is going to be able to supplement your defense on both of those fronts, making him the most valuable edge rusher in the class. So number 2, I mentioned him at the start of this list, is Bobby Wagner, the linebacker for Seattle. And guys, I mean, he's all over the field. The defense in Seattle is weak, and Wagner is one of the few reasons that defense is still relevant and keeps them in games. He's all over the field. He's an excellent on-ball linebacker and off-ball. He's able to track very well. He's able to penetrate the line very well and get you some tackles for loss. He is going to be able to get you defensive statistics in almost every one of these scoring categories this year. And then number 1, very similar to Bobby Wagner, guys, it's Darius Leonard. And he is another linebacker for the Indianapolis Colts. But when he came out of the draft, it was talked about that he could really play anywhere on the defense, and he has yet to show me any reason for me to not believe that. The guy's athleticism is through the roof. We see him get dropped back into coverage often. We see him rushing the passer. We see him as a run stopper. Darius Leonard can quite literally do anything for you at an elite level. And his flexibility and the fact that they could plug him pretty much anywhere on the defense, from safety all the way up to pass rush, means that Leonard is going to be the clear-cut number 1 individual defensive player for you heading into the 2020 season. So hopefully I was able to help you guys out a little bit with that. If you're interested in the individual defensive player leagues, I definitely suggest that you start diving into it now, because, again, I was kind of surprised that cornerbacks aren't really a big thing here. It's all about the linebackers and the guys that can just rack up stats all over the field. And there's a lot less emphasis on just being good at one specific thing. So start diving into it. Look at the guys you like. Watch a little bit of film. And you can give yourself a big advantage by doing some research ahead of time, because it's still a league type that not a lot of people are super familiar with. So you can be the king of your league just by dumping in a little bit of time to research these guys. So that's it, guys, for the top 10 IDP players for 2020. When we come back, it is time to go through the rankings. That's right, the top 30 fantasy wide receivers for 2020. You're listening to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. We'll be right back.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA. From the UFC to extreme cage fighting, they got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
And welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. I am your host, BSP, Brandon Soderpenner. Last segment broke down the top 10 IDP players in fantasy for 2020. For those not familiar, individual defensive players. It was a lot to get into, guys. I really didn't know a whole lot about that segment of fantasy until I started to really dive into it for today's episode. So if you have one of those leagues, I hope you were able to get some useful information out of that. But not going to keep you guys waiting anymore. This is my top 30 fantasy wide receivers going into 2020. If you've been listening to the past episodes, we have been doing wide receiver breakdowns each episode, division by division, north and south, and going to culminate everything with today's episode. This segment going to give you numbers 30 through 16, and then after that, the top 15 wide receivers in the class. Did something similar with running backs earlier in the season, and then after I finish the tight end and quarterback previews, which are going to be lumped together, going to give you definitive top 30s for each of those positions as well. Well, maybe not 30 tight ends. That sounds pretty miserable now that I'm saying it out loud. But either way, you'll have a ranking. I'll definitely do the top 30 quarterbacks, and then maybe I'll cut it down to 20 tight ends. I'll take a look at everything for you guys. So anyway, before we get into the full top 30, I'm going to give you a couple players that landed just outside of the top 30 that maybe you have in your rankings or experts have them a little bit higher than I do. So number 1 was Keenan Allen. Last episode I talked about him. It's not a product of Keenan Allen. It's a product of Keenan Allen's system. He's still a great player, but he's either going to have Tyrod Taylor or Justin Herbert throwing him the ball this year. They're going to be looking to be a little more conservative. The passing numbers are going to come down across the board. There's not going to be as many targets available. And because of that, I can see Keenan Allen very easily dropping outside of the top 30 wide receivers by the end of the year, which, again, is unfortunate because I love Allen the player. Next up, Stephon Diggs. He's another one, guys. He's a great talent. I could argue he's a top 15 NFL wide receiver. But unfortunately, his style of play didn't lend itself to fantasy to begin with. And then now that you're pairing him with Josh Allen in Buffalo, who is not the greatest deep ball passer as far as accuracy goes, it's just kind of like a perfect storm for him. So even though he's going to have the ability, I just don't see him having the fantasy numbers to finish inside of the top 30 this year. I've also got Marquise Brown, guys. He's kind of on the fence already. I think experts might have him at about 31, 32. The reason I'm mentioning him is because you would think being the number 1 wide receiver on one of the best offenses in the NFL should make you a lock to have a solid fantasy season. But unfortunately, Brown didn't have the greatest rookie year, which isn't to be completely surprising because, like I said, wide receivers take a little bit longer to come along than running backs typically do. However, they're not going to be throwing the ball, I don't think, enough to support him even if he does take a step forward. You've got Mark Andrews there as well. You've got 2 excellent running backs in J.K. Dobbins and Mark Ingram. And then you've got Lamar Jackson himself being a rushing threat. So it's not that Brown's not going to get any looks, but I don't think it's going to be enough, again, to finish in the top 30. Next up is T.Y. Hilton. And it's another frustrating one because there have been plenty of years where I've drafted T.Y. Hilton. He's done well for me. However, the injuries are starting to creep up on him. He's getting older. Got a new quarterback in there. We saw that he didn't play nearly as well after Andrew Luck left. So it's to be seen if he's going to be able to mesh well with Phillip Rivers. And then he's also got real competition there for targets between Paris Campbell and Michael Pittman Jr. And especially with Michael Pittman Jr., I think he has the skill set that Rivers is going to be looking for in his number 1 guy. So all the risks taken into account there, I had to move T.Y. Hilton out of my top 30. And then perhaps the biggest jump is Cooper Kupp, guys. I don't have him in my top 30. We know how good Kupp can be when he's on the field, and he will still see touches this year. However, I'm very concerned about the shift in offensive philosophy that we saw at the end of 2019 and the offseason moves that the Rams have made, bringing in more big tight ends, spending high draft capital on another running back. It seems like they're going to stick to those formations, which means that Kupp's just not going to see the field a whole lot. And when they switched everything last year, Kupp ended up finishing as the wide receiver 31 for that stretch of games after the bye week. So this is really hard for me, but I just don't think Kupp is going to get the volume to be able to sustain the numbers that he's had in the past. And he's got bust written all over him this year. And again, like a lot of players on this list, it has nothing to do with his talent and everything to do with the offensive system that he's going to be in. All right, so let's go ahead and start diving into the top 30. So number 30, guys, is Jamison Crowder from the New York Jets. I'm not sold on Crowder's ability, and I'm not really sold on the Jets' offense. However, when you look at some of the other players around this current wide receiver ranking, it's a lot of guys that have real question marks around them. And Crowder is actually a relatively safe pick just because he does have the number 1 receiver role really carved out in New York. So even if as I'm predicting, the passing offense isn't great, he's still going to be able to get a good amount of volume. I think Sam Darnold has some ability. He's going to be throwing the ball around a lot this year as he tries to really solidify himself as the Jets franchise quarterback, and Crowder's going to be the recipient of a lot of that. So he's a guy that I can see producing for you just off of pure volume. So Crowder's got some real value there at number 30. Number 29 is Marvin Jones Jr. from the Detroit Lions. Now, A lot of people are really high on Kenny Galladay this year, he is the number one receiver. He has produced better than Marvin Jones for several years now. However, when you look at the target share, even last year, before Marvin Jones was hurt, guys, they're getting very similar targets. So especially if you're looking into a PPR league, Marvin Jones has some real value for you. I also am projecting Matt Stafford to have a pretty solid year now that he has two good running backs behind him he can use to set up play action. So you can get some very, very solid week in and week out value from Marvin Jones. I think him and Galladay are going to be a lot closer in fantasy points by the end of the year than people are giving it credit. So like Marvin Jones there, number 28 is Tyler Boyd of the Cincinnati Bengals. Now, a lot of people think that just because A.J. Green is coming back this year, it means that Boyd's value is going to drop back off, and I'm here to tell you that that's not the case. Boyd was able to have an excellent fantasy season last year with Andy Dalton and Ryan Finley as his quarterbacks, guys. So just swapping out Joe Burrow and improving that offensive line a little bit is going to improve this offense eons, guys. It's going to be significantly better. There's going to be more passes to go around this year, more quality passes to go around this year. So while he may not be able to repeat what he did in 2019, I see Tyler Boyd having a set role on this offense behind AJ. AJ also has the potential of getting hurt. I don't think it's going to happen, but we saw him have to deal with injuries now for the last couple of seasons. So again, I like Boyd there. He's a solid wide receiver 3 who has the potential to blow up and be a wide receiver 1 for you if something were to happen to Green in front of him. All right, number 27 is Michael Gallup, the wide receiver for the Dallas Cowboys. A lot of people worried about Gallup this year. He had a strong rookie season in 2019, but now he's got CeeDee Lamb to deal with, who the Cowboys spent, I want to say, the 17th overall pick on. However, one thing we know about fantasy wide receivers is, generally speaking, as rookies, they take a lot longer to produce. Gallup has already proven that he can sustain that wide receiver 2 role behind Amari Cooper. So while he may lose a couple of targets, he's still going to be a focal point of this offense. You also got to think Randall Cobb and Jason Witten are both off of this team now. They accounted for about 160 targets in 2019, so you're going to be able to make up a little bit of ground there, even if they do decide to bring in CeeDee Lamb very quickly and start spreading around the ball more. But regardless, you should not be afraid to take Michael Gallup. He's got real solid talent here, and he's going to be one of the more consistent receivers on this team. Like Amari Cooper, we know he's notorious for being a boomer bust guy, and then we just don't know what to expect from CeeDee Lamb yet. So Michael Gallup, a nice safe pick here at wide receiver 27. Number 26 is a guy that I have faded quite a bit. That's probably the biggest faller on my list other than maybe Cooper Kupp, and that's Juju Smith-Schuster, guys. I'm not necessarily doubting his ability, but there's just a lot of things that have to go right in order for Juju to have a good 2020. This is all reliant on Ben Roethlisberger not only coming back healthy, but Ben Roethlisberger coming back with the ability that he left with, right? When Roethlisberger was healthy, it's taken him more and more games to kind of get his groove going and establish himself, get his legs underneath him. We don't know what he's going to look like coming back, and at this point in his career, we don't know how long he's going to stay on the field. It is a death sentence for Juju Smith-Schuster if they have to roll out either Mason Rudolph or Devlin Hodges again this year. He just did not click with them. It was already going to be a tough year for Juju because he's trying to establish that number 1 receiver role without Antonio Brown there. And not only is he facing tougher competition, but he's getting significantly worse quarterback play. So if we have the same recipe again going into 2020, Juju he's got bust written all over him. He could very easily finish way lower than I have him right now at 22. The reason he hasn't dropped further is because, again, if everything clicks, he could be a top 10 wide receiver for you. But there's just way too many things that need to go right for me to have Juju any higher than this. I am avoiding him in pretty much any draft this year. You can find a lot of experts that are going the complete opposite direction with him, but I just don't see it. There's way too many pieces that need to fall into place for Juju to have a good 2020. So number 25, guys, is Jarvis Landry. He's the wide receiver 2 for the Cleveland Browns. Landry is a guy that regularly gets undervalued because he's just not a sexy pick. He's not someone that's going to have breakout games for you every week, but he is someone that has consistent fantasy value. He has 100 catches, 1,000 yards pretty much every season since he's been in the NFL. So the last, if you take a look at his numbers over the last few years, I think the worst he has finished is wide receiver 17. And yet for some reason every year his ranking is somewhere in the late 20s, early 30s. So don't fall for that again. Just because he's not a big name player does not mean he can't get you consistent value. There is peace in being able to plug in your wide receiver 2 or 3 and know that he's going to get you a set amount of points every week and you just don't have to worry about it. So loving Jarvis Landry at this point in the draft. He may actually move up my boards as things go along. Number 24 was another big dropper for me, and that was DJ Moore. And I like Moore as a wide receiver. This is a story you're going to hear a lot, but Carolina's situation is very troubling for me this year. The one thing he has going for him is they're going to be throwing the ball a lot because that defense is really, really bad, right? They've lost a lot of key pieces. However, I don't know if Teddy Bridgewater is capable of really supporting a number one fantasy wide receiver. It's yet to be seen. He's been relatively conservative when he has been a starter, and we haven't really seen him in a legitimate starting role since Minnesota, 3 or 4 years ago now. So we don't know what it's going to look like now that he's being dropped in and he's been given the job right away. He's not behind anybody. He may just fall apart. We don't know that yet. So again, a lot of question marks around this. I also feel like Carolina has high tanking potential, which is the same reason that I'm kind of fading on Christian McCaffrey a little bit, because you may see them start to rest starters very quickly if they realize that they're going to be in prime position to grab either a Trevor Lawrence or a Justin Fields in the 2021 draft. So fading on DJ Moore a little bit. Number 23, guys, AJ Green. Most people still have him in the late 20s right now for their wide receiver rankings, and assuming A.J. Green comes back healthy, which there's not a lot of reason to think that he won't, guys, he's a wide receiver 1. Anytime he is on the field, he puts up fantasy wide receiver 1 numbers. People are nervous about him because they haven't seen him since the early parts of 2018. However, he's the same age of Julio Jones. It's not like this guy's ancient by any means, and he's going to be in a better offensive system than he's seen in a long time. He had the one MVP caliber season with Andy Dalton there, but he has never had a quarterback like Joe Burrow stepping in. So, again, as long as he's on the field, Green can shoot up the rankings and has the potential to be a top 12 wide receiver by the end of the year. His ability did not just fall off, right? As soon as Green is back, you guys are going to see that he is still the stud that he was when he was injured just a couple of years ago. Now up to number 22, I had to pick one of these guys to break out in Houston's offense, and you guys knew my opinion. It's Brandon Cooks. It was either going to be him or Will Fuller, and I like Will Fuller's ability and his speed and his connection with Deshaun Watson since he's now been there for a few years with him, but the injuries just, I can't get past them for Will Fuller, and that led me to put Brandon Cooks much higher than him. I think he's going to be the established number one wide receiver in that offense, and that shoots him way up the wide receiver rankings, right? They're both sitting at somewhere in the 30s right now, and that's because people don't know which one to go with. But when you look at Brandon Cooks, he's been on multiple teams now, and every time he just steps in and is able to produce right away. So even with the issues with Corona and the fact that there's going to be a limited offseason, that doesn't really scare me with Brandon Cooks because he's used to this. He knows how to just step in and get the job done, and I think that wide receiver 1 role with Houston is there for the taking for Brandon Cooks. Number 21, DJ Chark from the Jacksonville Jaguars. Yes, Jacksonville, guys. So Chark had a great rookie season last year. He has a little bit more competition with Laviska Shenault coming in, but Shenault is dealing with some injuries that he sustained during the offseason. So I think they're going to integrate him a little more slowly into the offense, which means that Chark is again the clear number 1 guy. A lot of people nervous about him because of the offense that he's tied to. However, a lot of the issues don't necessarily stem from the quarterback. I think Gardner Minshew is a little bit underrated. He kind of got, memed up and turned into this mythical figure last year because of his ridiculous mustache, and his whole story is fantastic, but I think people kind of lost the quarterback play and all of that. I mean, really, until he was taken out If he would have played every game last year and Jacksonville wasn't so obsessed with trying to get Nick Foles in because they paid him a ton of money, we're talking about someone that could have realistically taken the Rookie of the Year award away from Kyler Murray. So I do like Gardner Minshew. He's a very underrated deep ball thrower, and that's going to play well with what DJ Chark does as a wide receiver. So the targets are there for him. The ability is there for him. I'm high on DJ Chark this year, not only just for Dynasty being a young wide receiver, but he can definitely produce for you in your redraft leagues in 2020 as well. Number 19, guys, Tyler Lockett of the Seattle Seahawks. So this is another one where people seem to be debating, similar to the Tyler Boyd, A.J. Green situation, that only one wide receiver is really going to break out in that Seattle offense between him and DK Metcalf. I'm here to tell you that's not necessarily the case. Seattle, even with the addition of Jamal Adams, is not going to have a great defense this year. They're in a tough division with the Cardinals, the Rams, and then the 49ers. Teams are going to be putting up a lot of points on this defense, and that's going to force Russell Wilson to have to throw the ball more than he's used to. And from everything I've seen from Russell Wilson, he can definitely handle that, and he can support two solid fantasy wide receivers, and that's exactly what's going to happen this year. We know he has a good chemistry with Tyler Lockett already, and we also know that he has a set role in this offense already in the slot, meaning that with the increased passing volume, both him and DK Metcalf are going to be on the field at the same time. So it's not a one or the other situation, guys. If you think Lockett's going to be better than Metcalf, you can take him ahead of Metcalf, or vice versa, but both of them are going to have great fantasy seasons out of this Seattle offense. All right, now number 18 is Allen Robinson for the Chicago Bears. I have faded Robinson quite a bit. People are high on him because of the pure target potential that he has this year. He's the clear-cut number one in Chicago, but those targets don't mean anything if they're coming from Mitch Trubisky, right? And if Trubisky loses that job at some point this year to Nick Foles, that doesn't help Robinson either, because I think Robinson's volume is going to go down quite a bit, just because Nick Foles tends to want to throw to his slot guys and his running backs a lot more than the traditional X or Y receiver. So really, no matter who's in there at quarterback, I don't see it playing out incredibly well for Allen Robinson this year. It's kind of a pick your poison type situation. It's either lower targets or bad targets. Either way, I am not big on Robinson at all. I will let someone else take the risk on him. Right now, his wide receiver ranking is at 10, and it just keeps climbing every week, which is astounding to me. So I'm not big on Allen Robinson at all this year. Number 17, Courtland Sutton for the Denver Broncos. He had an excellent season last year, and he's another one that has the threat of rookies kind of creeping in on him. However, as much as I am sold on Jerry Jeudy as a wide receiver, he was my wide receiver one coming into the 2020 NFL Draft. Sutton has an established role already. I don't think Judy's going to be a world beater as soon as he steps on the field. And on top of that, he put up good numbers last year despite a ridiculous quarterback carousel, which should calm down significantly this year. He had Joe Flacco throwing him the ball. He had Brandon Allen throwing him the ball. But now you've got Drew Lock in there. We know he's going to be the starter. They have an off-season together now, knowing what the plan is going to be going into the 2020 season. When all is said and done, I think the more consistent quarterback play in 2020 is going to help counterbalance the fact that Courtland Sutton has more competition this year, and I can see him finishing about where he did at the end of 2019. So he is my wide receiver 17. And the last one for the bottom half of the list, guys, it's Devontae Parker for the Miami Dolphins. We saw him absolutely explode last year when Ryan Fitzpatrick was established as the starter. And the good news is for Devontae Parker, there's a really good chance that Fitzpatrick starts the entirety of this year, especially with the COVID-shortened offseason. I don't think Miami is going to want to take the risk with Tua Tagovailoa starting him right away, or really starting him at any point in the season. He had some injury questions coming in when he was drafted, and this just doesn't seem like the year that you're going to want to throw a guy like him out to the Wolves. So if Fitzpatrick's the starter, he's got that chemistry with Parker. He's an aggressive quarterback, and he's a quarterback that's going to be able to really sustain his volume week in and week out and play well to the things that Devontae Parker does as a wide receiver. So I'm going to have plenty of shares of Devontae Parker coming into 2020. I'm a big fan of what he's going to be able to do in that Miami offense. So that is numbers 30 through 16, guys. When we come back, going to wrap up the show with the top 15 fantasy wide receivers for 2020. You are listening to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. We'll be right back.
Check out the show built around the women of MMA. From the UFC to the extreme cage fighting, we got the fights covered.
Listen.
It's the Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast. The latest news of upcoming fights, discussions of previous matches. Join us as we talk to and about the biggest names in women's mixed martial arts, past, present, and future. When it's the women's fight game, you know where to listen to. The Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. I am your host, BSP, Brandon Soderpenner. Last segment, we gave you half of the top 30 fantasy wide receivers for 2020, went through numbers 30 through 16. So what that means now is we are down to the elite of the elite, guys, the top 15 receivers for your 2020 fantasy season. Now, before we get into that, I do want to go over just a couple other receivers that I do like this year, and I will have some shares in, despite the fact that they're not going to be higher picks. These are guys whose ADP is kind of way up there. So a couple of the names I just want to go through for you. John Ross, I've mentioned him a couple times, the Cincinnati wide receiver. His ADP is at 163 right now, and he's been generally underwhelming since he's come into the league. He was a very exciting prospect because of the speed that he had. He broke the combine 40-yard dash record and just hasn't been able to produce to this point. However, I think a lot of that comes from the fact that Andy Dalton just didn't have the arm that he needed to get Ross the ball. Now enter Joe Burrow, who, while he may not have the biggest arm in the NFL, is able to make every throw that you need for a franchise quarterback to make. And I just think he's going to be able to utilize John Ross in a way that we have not seen him used before. He is a dominant field stretcher. And if you go back and look at some of his tape, there are times where he's just getting completely missed by Andy Dalton and Ryan Finley. So I think Joe Burrow provides a much-needed quarterback upgrade, and you can see Ross really take off this year. And you're going to know right away, guys. If they're going to utilize him, you'll see it in week one. And if they don't, you just cut him. He's one of those week one waiver cuts that you're going to need to pick up guys that are exceeding expectations. So really low-risk prospect with John Ross there. I like Michael Pittman Jr. for Indianapolis as well. As I mentioned, he has the potential to become a favorite for Phillip Rivers very early in the season. He's a great contested catch guy. He's a receiver that is going to pair well with Phillip Rivers' aggressiveness and willingness to take chances. So I like Michael Pittman there. His ADP is 174. I've also got Mohamed Sanu, who's almost going undrafted. His ADP is up in the 250s. With a new quarterback in New England with Cam Newton there now, I think that it's going to take a little bit of time for the receiver room to really take shape. But Sanu's been all but forgotten about playing that slot role there. And with Julian Edelman expected to take a little bit of a step back and N'Keal Harry still developing as a wide receiver, I think Sanu has a real shot here to take over that number one wide receiver spot despite his ridiculously high ADP. Next up, Jalen Reagor, Philadelphia. His ADP still at 177, even though he seems to have the clearest path as a rookie wide receiver to have a number one receiving role right off the rip, guys. Alshon Jeffrey is more than likely to start on the PUP list this year, and Deshaun Jackson is just at a point in his career where I don't think he can sustain that number one wide receiver role week in and week out. So love Jalen Reagor. And then the last guy, guys, it's Randall Cobb, and I like him for a little bit of a different reason than these other guys. Randall Cobb in Houston is not going to threaten for the top spot with Brandon Cooks and Will Fuller in front of him. But with an ADP in the mid-200s, Cobb is going to be able to provide you great PPR value. He's going to be a target hog throughout the season and could easily still get you 100-plus targets in this Texans offense, right? And you're essentially getting him for free in a lot of drafts. He's someone that you can plug in a flex spot. He's got amazing value in your deeper leagues, and he's just kind of being forgotten about right now. So love Randall Cobb if you're looking for some late consistent value. And he's still a solid late pick, even though he doesn't have crazy upside. You don't need it with him. He's a nice little safety valve for you at the end of your fantasy lineup. So those are some other receivers that I like that I'm going to be targeting in later rounds this year. But let's go ahead and get into it, guys. The top 15 wide receivers for the 2020 NFL fantasy season. Coming in at number 15 is Calvin Ridley of the Atlanta Falcons. When it comes to number 2 receiving options on a team, he is one of the elites for you. It's him and Mike Evans, guys. So Atlanta's offense, we know is going to want to throw the ball a lot. That defense is a little bit suspect, but guys, Calvin Ridley is incredible, right? I really encourage you to go and watch some of his tape. If Julio Jones was not in front of him, I could make an argument that Ridley is a top 5 receiver in the NFL. I think he's already that developed even this early in his career. And like I said, Matt Ryan is going to throw the ball a lot. We've seen him be able to sustain 2 top-tier wide receivers multiple times through his career. Only quarterback that has done it more than him has been Aaron Rodgers. So don't be scared off by the fact that Ridley's the clear number 2 guy behind Julio. He's going to get plenty of targets, and his touchdown totals are probably going to exceed Julio. He's already done it 2 years in a row, and I wouldn't be surprised if they're looking to him as a true red zone target again. With Julio on the other side, he's going to get open plenty. So, again, big fan of Calvin Ridley this year. I'll have plenty of shares of him. Number 14, DK Metcalf for Seattle. Talked about his teammate Tyler Lockett just a few spots ago. DK Metcalf, again, a physical specimen, someone that developed very quickly in his first year, had a great rookie season. We knew he was going to come into the league raw. He had all the physical traits that you wanted, but wasn't the sharpest route runner in the world. Had a couple of questionable combine drills that really dropped his stock. But Metcalf is already really coming into his own. If you put a ball up there, he's going to be able to come down with it, right? I made this mention of him earlier in the season. 50-50 balls with him are going to end up being more like 80-20. He has crazy strength for a wide receiver, and we've already seen him and Russell Wilson click very early on. I think he's set for a boom year this year. His floor is a wide receiver too, which is pretty much what he was last season, at least later on in the season. And he's got real wide receiver 1 upside. So I've got him at 14. Really big fan of DK Metcalf. Number 13, guys, is Amari Cooper. I faded him slightly, right? You can't discount him too much because Cooper's part of such a great offense there in Dallas. But the reason I don't have him higher is because he is very boom or busty, right? And that's not necessarily a bad thing, and he has great numbers at the end of the season. However, if I'm drafting a number 1 receiver, I'm kind of trying to shy away from guys that aren't going to be super consistent for me, because numbers at the end of the year are great, but if you're losing games throughout the fantasy season because some of your guys just aren't showing up, that's going to hurt you more than the numbers really reflect. So Cooper's going to put up great numbers this year. He's going to have games where he hauls in 2 or 3 touchdowns and goes off for 150 yards. He's got that potential, and the offense is super high-powered. But again, just fading slightly because I don't know how much I can trust him from a week-to-week basis. So coming in at number 12 is Mike Evans of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Last year, him and his teammate Chris Godwin put up incredible fantasy seasons behind a very strange, I guess the word would be, a very strange year from Jameis Winston where he threw for over 5,000 yards and 30 interceptions. So there was a ton of volume in Tampa Bay last year. That's going to come back a little bit when you switch out signal callers and you go from Jameis Winston, who was an absolute gunslinger, just didn't really care where the ball was going. He just knew he was going to throw a lot, to Tom Brady, who's a lot more clinical, right? He's more like a sniper. He's going to get you the ball exactly where it needs to be, when it needs to be there, and he's not just going to be, chucking up balls for the hell of it. So with that all being said, I think Evans is the more likely of these 2 receivers to take a little bit of a step back, and it's not so much an issue of talent. I mean, both these receivers are incredibly talented, but it's just the type of receivers that they are and the role that they play. Mike Evans is a traditional number one outside type of wide receiver. And while Tom Brady has utilized those type of guys throughout his career, he doesn't seem to lean on them nearly as much as the slot receiver. See Wes Welker, see Julian Edelman. Brady is going to go to Chris Godwin early and often. And Mike Evans is still going to have a role because he is talented enough to where he's a big hulking red zone target. He's a veteran presence. He will click well with Brady. But the slot receivers traditionally with Brady have just succeeded more. They've gotten a significantly higher target volume, and I believe that's what's going to happen here in Tampa Bay. Not to mention that some of these targets are going to start going to the tight ends as well. I have a hard time seeing Brady leaving New England and going somewhere else without a promise that he's going to be able to run the offense in the way that he wants to do it. And with that being the case, Godwin's stock is up and Mike Evans' stock is down just a little bit. Number 11, guys, A.J. Brown of the Tennessee Titans. He had a great rookie season, specifically when Ryan Tannehill stepped in for Marcus Mariota. The kid just absolutely took off. Now, one of the reasons he was so great in 2019 was his efficiency, right? He didn't have a ton of targets, but he was able to make the most of them. This season, it's going to take a step back. I think the guy had a crazy touchdown rate last year, and that's not going to repeat itself, not in this offense where it's going to be run first, but he is the number one target. We know him and Tannehill have a great chemistry already, and Tannehill's going to be the starter all year. He got the contract, and he's the starter moving forward. So as long as Tannehill is in that lineup, A.J. Brown is going to be a legitimate receiving threat, and he will be a wide receiver one this year. Despite the offensive system, he has a role carved out, and this is one of the very few situations where, despite the fact that they have a philosophy of run first, the offense is still going to be able to support a number one receiver just because of the relationship that him and Tannehill have been able to build off of already. Number 10, guys, was a big riser for me, and that's Robert Woods. He's generally sitting in the 20s for most expert consensus rankings when it comes to wide receivers. Him and Cooper Kupp are generally right next to each other because this is one of the situations where we're waiting to see what happens. People don't know what to think of the situation, but I'm here to tell you that Robert Woods will be a wide receiver one this season, right? The only reason he's not higher is because Cooper Kupp is still there and can take a little bit away from him, but Brandon Cooks is gone now. Despite the fact that they changed offensive systems, Robert Woods is still constantly on the field. And in those situations, especially when Kupp is not alongside him in the slot, he has no real competition right now. They drafted Van Jefferson, but it's going to take a while for him to really develop. And that job is Robert Woods' to lose. And I think he's going to absolutely take off with it. Even though Jared Goff has some question marks around him, he's still a high-volume passer. And that is going to allow Robert Woods to put up some incredible fantasy numbers going into 2020. So I am all over Robert Woods, guys. He shot way up my draft board. And if I can get him anywhere, I'm definitely getting Robert Woods, especially where he's going in drafts, about 10 wide receivers after where I have him currently. So, again, huge into Robert Woods. Number 9 is Kenny Golladay. I did fade him slightly, but I couldn't drop him too far just because of some of the other names around him. Him and Marvin Jones are going to be closer in targets and fantasy points than I think people are expecting. However, traditionally he has done more with his targets than Marvin Jones. He is a very efficient wide receiver, and he's a guy that Matt Stafford seems to like to target more in the end zone than Marvin Jones and then Danny Amendola, who they also have there coming out of the slot. Golladay is going to be a solid receiver for you, but I don't think he's going to be the absolute stud that people seem to think he's going to be coming into this season. I understand the hype he produced last year, even without Matt Stafford playing for the large majority of the season. We should expect to have a healthy Matt Stafford for all of 2020, but Stafford's strength doesn't come from feeding one receiver the ball over and over again. He likes to spread the field a lot. We saw Matt Stafford take the biggest step in his career after Calvin Johnson retired because he finally felt like he didn't have to just continually force feed one elite guy. So I expect him to do that. I expect him to spread the ball around a lot. And again, Galladay will make the most of those targets, but it's not going to be as high volume as people are expecting. So I faded him just a couple of spots to my number 9 wide receiver. Number 8, Adam Thielen. I was kind of surprised that I'm higher on him than a lot of people are. And Thielen's going back to more of his slot role that he was comfortable with when Stephon Diggs was on the team. He took a little bit of a step back last year when they tried using him as an outside receiver, and that's not his strength. He's a guy that's going to be able to make the most of those short intermediate routes, really uses the middle of the field well, and is able to take advantage of a lot of those possession catches, right? He's going to rack up targets for you, and he still has good yak ability. He's not just a target vacuum. He's going to be able to utilize those too. And the way that Minnesota is setting up this year, without having Diggs there anymore and instead having Justin Jefferson, the rookie wide receiver, taking over that role, I really think that Adam Thielen could end up leading the league in targets this year. He could lead the league in targets and receptions from the wide receiver position, so I'm very high on him. I don't think he has top 5 potential just because he's not going to be that crazy field stretcher. He's not going to wow you with his athleticism, but the role he has cut out and how effective he is using that slot position to his advantage, he's going to get you good, consistent value week after week. So Adam Thielen there at number 8 for me. Number 7, another big fade for me, Davante Adams. And I like Davante Adams, the receiver. I don't put him in the elite category like everyone else does, but he is tied to Aaron Rodgers. I'm very nervous about that because the situation in Green Bay is incredibly volatile. You guys have heard me talk about it plenty, so I'm not going to dive into it again. But Adams is a big bust threat just because of the situation surrounding that organization right now. And I firmly believe that Rodgers is either going to be done in Green Bay partway through the year, and if nothing else, he'll be gone at the end of the year. And it's just going to be strange up in Green Bay. And just, I've got a really bad feeling about it. Because of that, and because of the other great names that you can get at the top of the draft, I'm fading Davante Adams. I will let somebody else take him, and I would much rather have a Julio Jones or a DeAndre Hopkins, someone who I know is in a much healthier situation from a franchise standpoint. So I'm fading Davante Adams, but he's still worth a shot if you can get him down here at wide receiver 7. Chances are you're not going to, though. He's still consensus wide receiver 2 most places that I've looked. So if you can, I'm avoiding Adams pretty hard this year. So number 6, Odell Beckham Jr., the Cleveland Browns. Odell Beckham has burned a decent amount of people the last couple of years, specifically last year with Cleveland for the first time. There are a lot of things that went into that. Baker Mayfield had a very rough sophomore season, which isn't necessarily surprising. The offensive line was not great. They had a new coach in there with Freddie Kitchens who really didn't seem to have a grasp on the situation at all. And Baker needed some time to really develop. And it looks like this offseason he's taken that a little more seriously. Odell Beckham Jr. was fighting through injury and has finally taken care of that in the offseason, got the surgery that he needed. And we know how talented Beckham is. That doesn't just disappear. He's still that electric, spectacular catch kind of guy. He may not haul in a ton of targets, but when he does, he's going to take them deep downfield, and he's going to be a great red zone target now that he is completely healthy. The Browns situation as a whole has improved. The offensive line is better. You've got Kareem Hunt and Nick Chubb for the entirety of the year. So this will be a better team in 2020, and Odell Beckham Jr. is going to be the benefactor of that. So I've got him now up at my number 6 wide receiver. All right, guys, top 5, the best of the best. So here we go. Number 5, Chris Godwin of Tampa Bay. Heard me talk about him a little bit when I was mentioning his teammate Mike Evans. He's going to be the slot guy for Tom Brady, which is traditionally a receiving position that does well. And Chris Godwin is also the most talented slot receiver that Tom Brady has had in a long time, if not ever. Maybe peak Wes Welker was pretty incredible, but Julian Edelman to Chris Godwin, it's not even close. Godwin's taller, he's faster, he's more athletic, he's got better yak ability. Just everything is really adding up for him to be the number 1 receiving target for Tom Brady. Brady's going to be like a kid in a candy store this year with these significantly better receiving options, something he's really never had in his career with the exception of the couple years that he had Randy Moss. This Tampa Bay offense is going to explode. And Chris Godwin is going to be at the top of this heap, so love him here at number 5. Number 4, Tyreek Hill. Faded him slightly, as I mentioned last episode, just because he's going to have amazing fantasy numbers for you at the end of the season. But like Amari Cooper, but to a little bit of a less extreme extent, he is boom or bust. So he's going to have some weeks where he just doesn't show up because Patrick Mahomes is finding other options across the field that are open. Hill gets a lot of attention on the defensive end of the ball because of his speed, and that will just take him out of games every once in a while. But then he will go off and just absolutely explode for you other weeks. So his numbers are going to look amazing at the end of the season, but bumping him down just a little bit because he has the tendency to disappear, especially in games where you have an elite cornerback on him. He is sometimes written out of the game plan, but still worth having on your team. He's an amazing wide receiver that speed kills, and it's not just speed. He's an underrated route runner as well. So love Tyreek Hill, just one spot lower than most people have him now at number 4. Number 3 is DeAndre Hopkins. People are nervous about DeAndre Hopkins because he's in Arizona now. He switched teams. All of his productive years came when he was still in Houston. However, not nervous about that. Without bringing up the list again, he has played for some atrocious quarterbacks. Deshaun Watson was by far the best quarterback that he's had, and he was producing with and without Watson. So Kyler Murray in Arizona is better than every other quarterback that he's played for besides Deshaun. And because of that, I'm not worried about Hopkins transitioning at all. He's going to be able to produce no matter who is throwing him the ball. He's that talented. His catch radius is out of this world. You just got to kind of put it up there, point it, and he'll be able to haul it in and make the most out of his receptions. I could go on about DeAndre Hopkins for days. From a talent standpoint, maybe the best in the NFL. But I'm not nervous one bit about him switching over to Arizona. There's some other talent there too, but I don't see them really drawing any targets away from him. He's just that elite, and they're going to be looking to go to DeAndre Hopkins early and often. He will always be a big part of their offensive game planning. All right, top 2 guys. Shouldn't be incredibly surprising. Number 2, Julio Jones. He's been going 4-5 in a lot of rankings because people are a little bit higher on guys like Tyreek Hill and Devontae Adams. But Julio has been the model of consistency every year that he's been in the league. Since 2014, his worst season from a receiving yard standpoint, 1,394 yards, and the lowest touchdown amount he had was 3 in 2017, and he was playing through an injury that entire year and was just acting like a decoy. Even at 31 years old, Julio Jones is one of the best fantasy prospects in the league. He's not going to have Michael Thomas upside because Michael Thomas is going to get crazy volume this year. Spoiler alert, he is going to be my number 1. But you cannot go wrong drafting Julio Jones if you were looking at a wide receiver after Thomas is already off the board. So I guess that kind of gave this away, but if you follow fantasy football at all, should not be surprised, guys. My number 1 fantasy wide receiver going into 2020 is Michael Thomas of the New Orleans Saints. Man, last year, finished 67 points ahead of the fantasy wide receiver 2. It's nuts, guys. That's like 3 giant fantasy games ahead of the next best guy. The only drawback I could see with Michael Thomas is if something starts to happen with Drew Brees where his arm just starts failing on him and he falls apart towards the end of the year, which has started happening more and more. However, they utilize him enough in the short and intermediate game to where Brees is still going to be able to go to Thomas often. They're not usually looking for him deep down the field. They just want to get the ball in his hands and let him go off and use his yak ability to his advantage. Michael Thomas is the number 1 guy this year. You do not need to be overthinking this at all. Should be noted, he's been consistent as well. The least amount of touchdowns he's had in a season since he's come into the league is 5 touchdowns in 2017, and we cannot forget, again, the season he had last year, 1,725 yards, 9 touchdowns on 149 targets. And even with Emmanuel Sanders being brought in, I see no real threat that will cause those numbers to come down. So there you have it, guys. Michael Thomas, the number 1 wide receiver for fantasy in 2020. Real quick before we get out of here, I will recap the full list here for you. Number 30 was Jamison Crowder of the New York Jets. 29, Marvin Jones Jr. from the Lions. 28, Tyler Boyd of Cincinnati. 27, Michael Gallup from Dallas. 26, Juju Smith-Schuster of the Pittsburgh Steelers. Number 25, Jarvis Landry from the Cleveland Browns. 24, DJ Moore of Carolina. 23, AJ Green from Cincinnati. 22, Brandon Cooks of the Houston Texans. 21, DJ Chark of the Jacksonville Jaguars. Number 20, Terry McLaurin of the Washington Redskins. 19, Tyler Lockett from the Seattle Seahawks. 18, Allen Robinson of the Chicago Bears. 17, Cortland Sutton of the Denver Broncos. 16, Devontae Parker of the Miami Dolphins. Now into the top 15 guys. Number 15 was Calvin Ridley of the Atlanta Falcons. 14, DK Metcalf from Seattle. Number 13, Amari Cooper of the Dallas Cowboys. Number 12, Mike Evans of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. 11 is A.J. Brown from Tennessee. Number 10, Robert Woods of the Los Angeles Rams. Number 9, Kenny Golladay of Detroit. 8, Adam Thielen of Minnesota. 7, Devontae Adams from the Green Bay Packers. Number 6, Odell Beckham Jr. of the Cleveland Browns. Number 5, Chris Godwin from Tampa Bay. 4, Tyreek Hill of the Kansas City Chiefs. 3, DeAndre Hopkins of the Arizona Cardinals. 2, Julio Jones from Atlanta. And again, the undisputed number 1 fantasy wide receiver for 2020, it is Michael Thomas of the New Orleans Saints. So again, thank you for listening today, guys. I hope you enjoyed as we went through my top 30 fantasy wide receivers of 2020. Starting next episode, we will begin to break down the tight ends and quarterbacks throughout the league. Going to get it going with the NFC and AFC North. So make sure you tune in next week for that. And as always, guys, thank you for listening to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'd like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show, write us a nice review, let us know what we can improve on. Any kind of feedback is going to help us out a lot. Also, make sure you follow us on Facebook, we're on Twitter, and we're on Instagram as well. So thank you guys again. Have a good night, and take it easy.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.